שלום לכל אלה שהגיעו. אני אעבור מיד לאנגלית. The guest, Professor Sheldon רוטבלט, will be introduced by Professor זאב תדמור, and we continue with our periodic meetings of the Forum for Higher Education. Sheldon, Zev will say a few words because I think you're responsible for this, for these occurrences to some extent. And my colleague here, before we continue, my co-chair, Moshe, wants to say a few words. אתה רצית עכשיו לקבל הפעם הבאה? טוב.
אני רק רוצה להודיע, הפגישה ב-25 בדצמבר של הפורום הזה תהיה במתכונת קצת שונה. לא יהיה לנו מרצה מרכזי שאחר כך ישאלו כמה שאלות, אלא יהיה מרצה, מנהל טרכטנברג במקרה זה, אבל אנחנו רוצים לעשות את זה במתכונת של סיור מוחות, כך שיהיה יותר זמן לאנשים להביע דעתם, ומי שרוצה לחשוב על זה מראש ולהכין שיעורי בית ולהביא איזה רעיון מובנה. הנושא יהיה המבנה של ההשכלה הגבוהה, קשר מכללות ואוניברסיטאות. אז זה מה שאני רוצה להגיע. זה יהיה סיור מוחות, ותחשבו על זה בצורה כזאת. 25 לדצמבר, יהיה פגישה מעניינת.
In order to introduce Sheldon, I have to stand up because he's a very, very important person. Professor Sheldon Routeblad is a professor of history at Berkeley, and he's truly a world-renowned expert on higher education. His advice is thought by countries in Europe and other places. He has a huge experience with the University of California, and he had important positions in the California university system. Sheldon is closely tied to Israel for many, many years. He has been coming here repeatedly to Van Leer, to the Israeli Academy of Sciences, to the Naaman Institute. We had two major conferences on higher education that we did, and Sheldon participated in both of them. And Sheldon left excellent advice after one of the conferences, Massification of Higher Education, I believe it was. He sat down and wrote a 25-page letter to me addressed to all of us, advice and good advice as to what we should do in the Israeli higher education. As a result of that conference and as a result of his advice, this forum was established to create a dialogue between colleges and universities, which was missing, which is very important, and which I hope will bear fruits in due time. So I think it's a great pleasure to have him here. We all of us appreciate deeply his devotion to Israel and our higher education. And besides that, we had some very nice dinners at his home. Thank you very much for coming again.
Thank you. Zev, that's overwhelming introduction. The only thing that was true about it is that I really love this country and my friends. The rest of it is Mishigas, as you well, I have wanted so long, for many years, for this kind of organization to be created. When the colleges first emerged in Israel, and I was with a group of people, we said, pay attention to this development. It's going to be extremely important. And I won't go into the history of all of that, but I see today, this visit, I think, almost more than any other visit, I think that Israeli higher education is on the tipping point, on the edge of something different historically, something significant. And I won't go into that now, but I do believe that this is a great opportunity now to create a higher education system that's integrated and sensible and individual. I say individual because often enough one is asked about models of universities, models of curriculum, models of this, models of that. Right, well, models is just a way of talking. It's a way of comparing. There is no model that fits every situation at all. And every nation with its own cultural heritage has to develop the model that's suited to it. But there are things to learn from other societies by way of comparison. things to learn that are positive and things to learn that you shouldn't do. I was asked to talk about California, and I think that this is an opportunity, really a major opportunity to do so. A year and a half ago, when I was with Zev, I would have spoken quite differently in many respects about what has happened to my native state. The situation today I would not say is unprecedented, but no one would have foreseen some of the developments that have occurred. I'm going to have to give you a little bit of history, right? This is what professors of history do. They talk about the past, and then they're always asked to talk about the future. And I don't know anything about the future, you see, because I haven't been there. But I can talk about the past, and we can talk about the present. And what the future will hold, I don't know. I don't know. It depends on what one believes about trends and whether one is spotting a trend. Historians always wonder at what point did something start to change and happen, but you don't know that until the process is over. Let me give you a little bit about the California situation. The reason for citing California is that that state managed to produce the world's, I think it's fair to say, the world's most famous public higher education research institution and system. And it was regarded as such by many countries, and visitors galore to learn about the California system. Why that happened historically, why California should have acquired that attention is a matter for historians to talk about. Quite briefly, it was an extremely wealthy territory on the Pacific coast. Its various climate zones encompassed every kind of economic benefit. It attracted a very dynamic population. This was part of American history, always to move west, kind of frontier mentality, get away from the settled areas where rigidities, class relationships were fixed, to new territories, new places where new ideas could burgeon, new success stories could be built. And indeed, that happened very, very quickly, so that a state that was Mexican territory, belonged to Mexico, belonged to Spain, actually, and then belonged to Mexico, was independent by 1850, was taken over by America. And by the end of the 19th century, then, a higher education university, Berkeley, was established and successful. Okay? Almost with the founding of the state came this university. But it was aided by congressional legislation in Washington. So it belongs to a category of American state universities, which you know. It's called the Land Grant University, as a consequence of an act of Congress passed during the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln's administration. And the Land Grant, or Morrill Act, after the senator whose legislation it was, the Land Grant Act said that states can be given federal land. The federal government owned almost all the land in the United States and still owns most of the land. That Washington would give states land if they used the land to establish a university. And the land could be sold and the proceeds taken, but the proceeds would have to be used for a university, or a university could be built on the land that was given. The requirement was that such an institution must be a technological institution. It must do agriculture for a state with those agricultural resources. That was necessary. And it must also do mining engineering, because the state had those kinds of resources. Apart from that, the legislation did not prevent the states or the universities from teaching anything else. So immediately Berkeley started to teach Latin and so on. Okay, so you got the full panoply of university topics, but it had to teach agriculture and mining. Important part of the story is that within 10 years of its foundation, 1869, in 1879, the university almost disappeared. The result of a crisis, this is pertinent to the later remarks, the result of a crisis between two economic communities in the state who were vying for control of the university. One was the agricultural interest, very extensive. They wanted an agricultural college. And the other were the emerging city elites who wanted something broader to include professional education and that sort of thing. The situation was so terrible that a constitutional convention was held in the state, and out of it came a formula which has served the University of California very well until now. That formula was that the university would be an independent body that would not be under the control of the state government, but would come under a board of trustees called the regents. And the regents would own the university, and they could sell property, and they could acquire property. Now, boards of trustees occurred all over the United States right from the colonial period onward, because that was the way in which the colonies created universities. They first appointed boards of trustees, they later appointed presidents, and they later appointed professors. But boards of trustees ran it. The difference was in the public sector that the regents were constitutionally independent. And to this day, if you enter the campuses of the University of California, there are now 10, you will not see any sign saying this belongs to the state of California or to the people of the state of California, but it is the property of the regents of the University of California. That independence, the ability to establish curriculum, to determine admissions, to engage in research activity, has often been accounted the reason why the University of California achieved international eminence. Other states did not have that system. The state of Wisconsin, I think it's still true, the legislature could in fact dictate the curriculum. And in other states, the political bodies did continually interfere. I wouldn't leave you for a minute with the thought that legislatures did not ever try to interfere in the running of the University of California. Of course they did, and continually do. They will. They give money. Anybody who gives money wants to have some say on how that money is used. The difference is that the constitutional position makes it harder for the legislature to intervene. It doesn't prevent it from doing so, but makes it harder. Okay? An important point. The university grew in time as the state grew, and its history has been closely identified with California. California emerged as the 8th largest economy in the world, still today, as measured by gross domestic product. It's not the only way to measure wealth, but that is the common way to measure wealth. It has a population currently of at least 35 million people, so it's larger than most European countries. It may have a population larger than that, but much of the difference would be illegal population coming across the border from Mexico. So it's a huge state. It is certainly the size of the British Islands, but with a population, well, Britain has about 55 or 60 million, so California, some 35 million. It has famous industries, Hollywood, right, the movie industry, and the television industry, and of course Silicon Valley, a make-believe name. There is no such a place as Silicon Valley. It's just a piece of territory south of San Francisco to Stanford University, and Stanford University's history has been closely identified with the computer industry. Stanford and Berkeley are friendly rivals. Stanford is the junior university. It was founded in 1894, but of course it's immensely rich and immensely famous, and has emerged as one of the top 10 American research universities, one of the great universities of the world. They're friendly rivals. One is private, one is public. Until about 1960, there was only the Berkeley campus as the original founding campus of the university. And the campus that today is known as the University of California at Los Angeles, a very large campus with a slightly larger student population than Berkeley, and with a medical school in a rich, well, a lot of wealthy people in the Southern California area, a lot of poor people as well. That campus, about 60 years ago, was a branch of Berkeley. It was not independent. It was governed from Berkeley. It was an outpost of Berkeley. It did not have a chancellor. It did not have a president. It had a provost who answered to a man called the president and the Berkeley campus. And that wasn't going to last. That campus was too powerful, too strong, too well supported to ever simply be a part of a fiefdom. It had to be independent. Many other campuses then grew up as a consequence of population growth in the post-war period. There were agricultural schools, there were oceanographic institutes, there were astronomical laboratories, and these were all combined, pulled together, and new campuses were created. The last one, the 10th campus, created in the interior valley of California, opened, well, graduated its first class about last year. And Michelle Obama was the speaker at the graduation ceremonies. There are a lot of controversies about that because already the problem of declining revenues was apparent. Could the university, could the state afford a 10th campus? And many planners said it was a foolish idea and should never have been attempted. But the reason for it is that there are several million people living in that area. To have the university, branch of the University of California in your area is regarded as high prestige. Not so much the other colleges. They're important, very important. But the University of California has the prestige. And people want access to that prestige and that institution. There are also about 1 million Hmong people living in that area. These are Vietnamese mountain people who fought with the Americans in the Vietnam War and then were allowed to come out for their safety when the communists took over. They've now produced several generations of children, highly successful. Following the Hmong, the Merced campus, yeah, the center. They're highly, the Asian American and Asian California students are hugely successful students. These are old populations except for the Hmong. They go back to the 1900s. So they're hardly newcomers. Well, the university flourished as long as the state flourished and as long as there was a particular political understanding of the relationship between a university and a state, and the Constitution served the university well. But something started to happen about 20 years ago, and those who look carefully at the operating budgets of the excuse me. Those who looked carefully at the operating budgets of the University of California began to notice a serious decline in the percentage of public tax money used to support the university. When I came to Berkeley to teach in 1963, we used to say about 66%, 2/3 of the annual operating budget came from the state. The operating budget used largely for teaching. The research budget was never a major aspect of state funding. It was really federal government, some private industry, some foundation assistance, but mainly Washington. So the state gave only a little bit of money for research. It never gave very much, but it did take care of teaching and associated student activities. And the funding was based on a particular kind of agreement about how much money would be given for each student, undergraduate student, how much money for each graduate student or professional student, a weighted formula which had been negotiated with the State Department of the Treasury. The really significant feature in the history of the University of California, Berkeley, beside the fact that it was somehow rising very rapidly. I think there was a British visitor around 1910 who said, University of California and California arose in the night like an Aladdin's palace, quite suddenly. It was a meteoric rise to eminence before the Second World War, particularly already strong in the sciences, producing Nobel laureates. Oppenheimer was there, Lawrence was there, all the great physicists, and the great schools of anthropology, modern anthropology. Already there was eminence to build on, but the real brilliance overall began after 1945. What else was happening in California is that such a large and growing population required many different kinds of higher education institutions. And so we began to see other kinds of institutions being created, both private and public. The public ones were usually created by various legislative districts. They were colleges, and they gave first degrees, or they were community colleges, 2-year institutions, which gave an associate degree and had multiple functions. They were open admissions, still are. Anyone could enter with or without a secondary school diploma. They prepared for entry-level occupations, still do. And they provided the rudiments of a general education suitable for transfer from that level to a higher level institution. Though these were growing up quite rapidly in California in the 1920s, 1930s, 1950s. It was becoming a financial problem because as the colleges spread, funding became a major issue. Local districts could not really support them, and so the leaders of those institutions were putting increasing pressure on state government to pay for the students, but also pressure to become universities, which meant to have professional schools and to support a substantial research effort. You understand that kind of pressure. All countries understand that kind of pressure. New institutions take as their model, usually, the leading status institutions. They want to be like them. This happened in Britain with the enormous expansion of the polytechnics. Many of them wanted to be research universities, and now most of them are, as a consequence of legislation introduced in Britain in 1992. The line separating the polytechnics from the research universities was abolished. There are some polytechnics left, but there are many more of them have become universities. The binary line, those of you who know about Britain know, the binary line was the line separating two different types of institutions. One that could give a degree, one that could give a diploma, but not a degree. The moment, this is relevant to our story, the moment that line was abolished in 1992, new universities being created, they demanded the same level of resource of Oxford and Cambridge, the Imperial College of London, and so on. No government can afford to fund the numbers of research universities that were clamoring for attention. Back to California. The same thing then was happening, only much earlier. Legislators were under pressure to fund the colleges, but they had no knowledge of how to do that. What should be the level of funding? How should it be related to the mission of the institutions? They needed advice on how to do that. There was a real impasse, and out of that ferment came a brilliant solution. And that is the solution that people all over the world have come to California to find. Okay? That solution was called the Master Plan for Higher Education for the state of California for 1960. Okay? The Master Plan still exists, but when I left Berkeley a few months ago, there was increasing talk of the Master Plan being dead. It is not dead. There is nothing to replace it. but we should try to understand why there is such talk. Well, you know, academics are notorious gossips. They like to spread rumors. And I like to call my colleagues in the world of academia medieval monks. They like to have a strong abbot to protect them, you know, against the king or anybody else. It's a sensitive group of people, very high-strung, aristocratic, easily succumbing to rumors. Anyhow, the situation is serious enough to, at least to give rise to rumors. The master plan created four, actually, higher education segments, three of which were public, one of which was private and was not really governed by the terms of the plan, but was an important part of the state's provision for higher education. The plan, if we talk about the binary divide in Britain between two types of institutions, the master plan created a trinary divide. And sometimes we joke in saying it was very un-American to do so. It was very European to do so. Why? Because in America you were supposedly had market conditions, and market conditions allowed any institution to compete for money and attention, and to prevent an institution from doing so was European, but not American. So the California Master Plan was un-American. The three segments were the University of California, the State College and University segment, and the community colleges. Today there are about 108 community colleges, there are about 23 state colleges, and there are the 10 University of California campuses. The State College and University system is a 5-year system. It grants master's degrees, but not any higher than that. Now, it was always called the State College system. So why now do we say State College and Universities? Because they wanted that title university, just like the British polytechnics wanted that title university, and just like in every country, the lesser status institutions, legitimately lesser status or not, want that title. So in America, we have an easy answer to that question. We give them the title, but we don't give them the privileges that go with the title. Call yourself whatever you want, okay? It's okay. There may be a little bit of a fight about it. The University of California did not like, actually, giving the state colleges that title. A little bit of academic snobbery in there, but ultimately the American way won, right? Call yourself whatever you like, but that doesn't automatically give you any privileges. The state colleges were reluctant to enter into an arrangement which prevented them from granting professional degrees or research degrees, but they did so because it was better than what they had before. Now they got guaranteed state funding, they got a clear mission, and they could do certain types of applied research up to the master's level. The community colleges were not so well provided for. They're still mainly funded by their local taxing districts, and so there are a lot of problems there. The state college and university system has not given up, to this day, the effort to become research universities. They try all the time. They've tried from the beginning. They want the right to grant doctor's degrees. They want the right to grant law degrees, medical degrees, and so on. There is no way in which that will happen. There is no money for that. And the mistake that Britain made, I really think, will not be made in the state of California. All right, so it was a hierarchical system. The University of California clearly at the top, monopoly on medical instruction and legal instruction and all graduate PhD instruction. The most select admissions criteria for entry, limited to the top 12% of a graduating class, and that's a figure that has never been very accurate, but the point really is it was to be select entry. The state college and university sector would take 33% of a graduating pool, and the community college sector would take anybody, everybody, adults, late adolescents, everybody, okay? Open admissions. So that was the un-American system. Lines, status lines drawn between public institutions. What was the American part? The American part was to allow those three sectors to be connected via student transfer, an extremely important and brilliant American innovation. Okay? Go to a community college, excel, and you could take the credits earned in a credit unit system, and that was an American invention in the late 19th century to allow for transfer. You could take those credits, which were being banked in a way, and move them to another institution and take your degree from that institution. Okay? And that allowed for upward mobility for those who were able to profit from it. So the graduate school, the professional schools at the University of California, different story. There's no automatic transfer of any kind there. That's separately run from the undergraduate admissions. Okay? So that meant it was on the basis of the graduate research and professional schools at the University of California built its international reputation, not on the basis of its undergraduate education. I happen to think the undergraduate education very good. There's a very strong teaching commitment, but a student at the University of California, an undergraduate, is not going to be treated like a student at the great liberal arts colleges of the United States. They're going to encounter larger classes and so on. But not uniformly, but it's the graduate school where the reputation was built. That was the solution. That was the model, the California model. It was not adopted by all the states. It was looked at differently. I'll give you two examples. It was always looked at, but for political or other reasons, other states came up with other solutions. New York, for example, established a state university system. It did not really have one, and it's called the State University of New York. But unlike the California system, it includes all different kinds of levels of institutions in one system. It doesn't separate them by a trinary line. That was a mistake because it means now that there's internal fighting within the system as the lesser ranked institutions fight with the higher ranked institutions, whereas the trinary line prevents that from happening, or it keeps the fighting within the family, if you like, and doesn't let it spill over into the neighborhood. Massachusetts, the state of Massachusetts has a 5-campus system, includes a medical school. The flagship is the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, Massachusetts, but it also includes institutions whose mission and whose student body are different from one another. And that also has raised serious infighting difficulties. Okay? So the California system was looked at, but it was not uniformly adopted anywhere. And it may very well be that the master plan, the state of California of 1960, was only possible in the particular post-World War II circumstances of California. Well, what do I mean? First of all, there was growing prosperity. Money was available. Secondly, there was a different political attitude in the state, whether Republican or Democratic. The two representatives of the political parties all were strongly supportive of the University of California. Also for historical reasons, many of the legislators elected to the two houses of the political houses of the state were graduates of the University of California and therefore loyal alumni. Okay? This is the Oxford and Cambridge phenomenon in the old days, where the civil servants and the Oxford and Cambridge dons were similar in attitude and style. So the University of California entered a golden age in the 1960s and the 1970s. A terrific public support, great pride in the achievements of the institution, a brilliant succession of Nobel laureates. I think there were 9 or so, I've forgotten how many in that period, or stretched out, of course. But anyhow, a marvelous period of public support. So what has happened? Why are there rumors and talk about the death of the master plan, the decline of public higher education in California, the crisis of the publics? Okay? Several things have happened. One, of course, is the economic downturn, which hit California harder than many other states. They're about, I think the official national rate of unemployment is some 10%. These are to be taken with a grain of salt. You never know exactly, but around 10%. The official rate in California about 12%. The real rate 15 or 16% unemployment. There's a lot of people without jobs. Downturn in Silicon Valley and other aspects of the economy. Also, the immigration into the state of very low-income populations with low reading skills and writing skills, with a lot of English as a second language being taught. Okay? And this has exacerbated an old problem in California way back, and that is very poor secondary schools. The highest high school dropout rate in the United States is in California. So here you have an anomaly. You have one of the wealthiest areas in the world. You have brilliant creativity in Hollywood and Silicon Valley. You had the creation of a public university system, the envy of the world, and you have the highest student dropout rate. You have extraordinary, large, poor population, and you have something else. I once had a teacher who told me that if you do stupid things, they will eventually catch up with you. Okay? Well, what are the stupid things in California? And I want to give you some time to talk, so I don't want to ask questions, so I don't want to go on. You do want to know about the stupid things, don't you? What are the stupid things? The stupid things turns out to be, to my mind, far more serious than the economic situation. There will be a recovery of some kind. It will take a while. Unemployment, the economists tell us, employment always lags. Recovery there always lags behind other indicators. It's a tragedy for those who are unemployed, but I do think the economy will rebound. Not exactly the same way, another way. Okay, it's been that way. It's been up and down before. The real problem with the state of California is one that Israelis ought to concern themselves about quite seriously, and that is a dysfunctional political constitution. The very dysfunctionality of that was concealed as long as the state was wealthy. But once the state entered economic decline, the fault lines in the political system were extremely apparent. So what are they? 100 years ago, California was one of the American states that passed a body of legislation to curb corruption in government. We went through a period in American history, well, maybe we've never gotten out of it, where public officials took bribes and nepotism and all the other things. You know so well. Do I have to tell you about that? You do know all about that. There was a reform movement called the Progressive Era Reform Movement. The effort was to pass legislation to prevent that from happening. That was successful for a time. But part of that legislation was to create a plebiscitarian constitution, meaning that laws could originate from the voting population as well as from the legislature and could be passed by the voting public by a simple majority, whether or not the governor or the legislatures wanted to. Now, there are a few countries in the world that have that. I think some of the Swiss cantons have a plebiscitarian constitution, but very different social composition. The consequence of that became apparent about 1980, okay? When a series of laws were passed by plebiscite vote. You know how that works? A group starts petitioning the population, acquires several 100,000 signatures on a piece of legislation. It is put to a vote, an election, and if it passes, it is law. Governor can't veto it, the legislature can't veto it. Not every state has that constitution. California is one of a few states that does. Laws began to be passed in 1980 limiting the taxation that could be imposed by the central government in the state. A pujadist tax revolt. What was the cause of that? Well, the cause of that was initially the fault of the legislature. The state had run a surplus. It had more money collected through taxation than it was using. The public knew this because the press made a big stink about it. What could the legislature have done? give back the money in tax rebates would be one, or spend it on some social cause or something that had popular approval, medical assistance, assistance for poverty and so on. But the legislatures we're beginning to see that shift in American politics towards two ideological groups, just as you have in Washington today. The Republicans and the Democrats could not agree on how to spend that money or to give it back. That became quite apparent, and that led to the tax revolt. The public was so angry at the fact that money was being collected that was not being used, that it voted for this legislation limiting property taxes, limiting all kinds of taxes, and making it almost impossible to fund education at any level adequately. Furthermore, a series of other kinds of legislation came up in plebiscitarian vote, which are called legal entitlements, specifying that a certain percentage of the annual budget will go to specific places without the legislature being able to determine how that money is spent. So there was one law saying a certain amount of money ought to go to kindergarten instruction. There was another that said it ought to go to particular kinds of aid to the needy. The result of that, by the year 2000, is that a legislative body, like the legislature of the state of California, cannot dispose of about maybe 60 or 70% of the budget. It may only have about 30% of the annual budget to use at its own discretion, because the laws have specified how that money is to be spent, and the laws have specified how much money cannot be spent. Furthermore, another stupid innovation was to restrict any vote on a budget to 2/3. You need a 2/3 vote of the legislature to pass any budget. Imagine you cannot get a budget through with a majority vote, 51%. You cannot. It has to be 66%. That means a minority party, and it's the Republican Party that's the minority party, can block any attempt to create a budget. The Constitution states that the California budget must be finished by about June the 1st. It took until about October to pass a budget. It's a clear violation of the Constitution. It's been going on for years that way. Nobody seems to care. A dysfunctional Constitution means that of the amount of money that the legislature has to spend at its own discretion, the higher education falls into that category. Let me tell you something shocking. Some of you know this. The amount of money spent on maintaining the penal system, the prison system in the state of California, exceeds the amount of money spent on the entire higher education system. Okay? This is a scandal, and it's shocking, but it is utterly true, and it has been true for several decades. The huge prison population, why? Because of another bit of plebiscitarian legislation. If someone is convicted of the possession of a small amount of marijuana at least 3 times, they go to prison and they stay there. So you have the prisons filled with petty offenders as well as major offenders. And of course they are largely members of a minority population. They're largely Hispanic or African American. California became overwhelmed by its social problems, and it did not have the financial wherewithal because of a political problem. That political problem is acute today. That's why I say it is not so much an economic issue as it is a political issue. So I'm going to sum up so that questions can be asked, but I'll just finish the formal presentation this way. So what is the University of California doing about it now? The entire University of California system is $800 million short of what it needs simply to carry on. I'll only deal with the Berkeley campus. They're all in the same situation. Each campus is independent but held together by a president's office and also by an academic senate comprising representatives of all the 10 campuses. A pretty good governance system. Okay, Berkeley has declared that every professor, everyone teaching, will take 2 days a month as unpaid furlough. Okay? So that's a salary cut. However, if you are a scientist and you're in receipt of grants, you can use grant money to replace that money. Doesn't affect historians quite to the same degree, as you could see, but those who have external grants. There's going to be some effort to use science grants in the summer, redistributed to help junior faculty who might find this a hardship. There have been layoffs of non-academic staff. They've simply lost their jobs. Okay? So there are all kinds of initiatives of that kind at cost cutting. Right now, the university is being kept a bit afloat because of stimulus money from the Obama administration. Part of that stimulus package you read about is going to universities and colleges around the United States. So I think some 23 million may be coming to the Berkeley campus. So that's just keeping your head a little bit above water. But next year, what about next year? Will there be a stimulus package next year? You can't rely on a stimulus package, a short-term effort. The university has appointed a blue ribbon committee composed of all kinds of people, including people from the outside, to examine, reconsider all of the ways in which the campus has operated in the past. Put everything on the table and discuss the entire structure and organization of funding, admissions policy, and so on. The chancellor of the campus, there's a president for the 10 campuses, there's a chancellor for each campus. The chancellor wrote an article for the op-ed, the editorial pages of national press, arguing that the federal government ought to support 10 public universities, research universities, of elite quality. 10. Now, you have 50 states. However, Congress would have to pass such legislation. You don't think Louisiana wants to be one of those states? It's a silly proposal, but it might have been simply to catch attention to the crisis, because in and of itself, it's bound to fail. Okay? There's no way it could succeed. The chancellor has also proposed bringing in more students from out of the state of California, just as the British have brought in students from overseas. Why? Because their fees are higher. Now, that will not sit well with the people of the state of California, whose children cannot afford to go to the university anymore, because once it was almost free, and now there is a tuition cost of $8,000 a year. Not much by private standards, but we're not talking private standards. We're talking about a public university. So I think that's a mistaken idea. But you see, as the revenue was falling from the state, the tuition fees were increased from nothing rapidly to $8,000. And for the professional schools, I was shocked to hear that it was at least $25,000 to go to the law school at Berkeley. And I have no idea what it costs to go to the medical school in San Francisco, but it would probably be astronomical. That means student loans. That's another problem in the United States. So the master plan is not dead, and the chancellor said nothing about the fact that theoretically, if the Berkeley campus became one of 10 national elite public universities, what would happen to its place within the master plan system? That was the great glory of California. He said nothing about that. So I've not had a chance to talk to him about it, to find out what his reasoning was or the rest of it, but it seems to me that this is, either this is carefully crafted effort to reach and influence public opinion, or it's simply not thinking straight about the historical situation of the University of California. All right? So right now, a blue ribbon committee being appointed to examine every aspect of the funding structure, admissions, and so on, and a terrific campaign in the state press and in the national press. So the New York Times has articles on this. The columnists have articles on the fate of California. The Economist, that internationally respected magazine, articles on California. This was the model, okay, that everyone looked at, even if everyone didn't follow it. And the future will tell us whether this is going to be a model anymore. So I bring you not so happy news, okay? I can only say one thing that historians always say, and that is that we live in the short run, but history lives in the long run, and we have to wait and see.
Thank you very much. Okay, we now open the floor for comments, questions. Your hand.
I have three short questions. How much are public representatives involved in the management or in any influence on the running of the university? Question two, faculty in a state university, can he apply to the NSF, NIH, and so on and get a private grant? And third, you mentioned the transfer of credit. How far it goes? Can one transfer credit, say, from community college studying mathematics all the way to the University of California, and how it works? Because the difference in study is different.
Good. Three good questions. No public involvement in the governance of the University of California. Legislative pressures put on, the way legislative pressures are put through news, through the news media, through negotiations over the budget, which is done with the president's office. But the constitutional separation of the university gives it self-governing. The regents own the university. The regents are very sympathetic to this situation, okay? And by and large very loyal to the institution. The second was a yes. Any individual anywhere in any kind of institution can apply to any grant-giving agency. The state universities do not have a research mission, but individuals, if they have a research project, can go after it. The problem is, of course, by then they're not in institutions which have an infrastructure to support them, but it depends on the kind of research. Certainly in the social sciences they could have money for this, and so on. And the third is the transfer system, and that is part of the master plan. After 2 years at a community college, if you have taken the right kinds of subjects, mathematics or whatever it is that the university requires, you may transfer in with not such a high average, but it's a question of places. You may not get your first choice as to which of the 10 campuses you want. In fact, those who are applying directly from high school, where the standards are higher, also are not guaranteed admission to their campus. But if they don't get into Berkeley, they may get into Irvine or some other campus. Clark Kerr, who was the brilliant, the greatest American university president of the last 50 years, he died just a few years ago at the age of 92, he was the great architect of the master plan. He worried all his life whenever the numbers of transfer students fell below a certain level, 20%, let's say. He worried because the legitimacy of the university with the public depended on the transfer level being maintained. Now, there's those who I've argued in the past that, well, the community college students have met a minimal standard to get in. The other students have met a maximum standard to get in. Therefore, we are letting in students who are not the high achievers. That's not clear. Some students go to community colleges because they can't afford a 4-year university, but they can't afford a 2-year. So some of them are as good and we're eligible. It's a complicated issue, but the door must be kept open.
And do they get full credit for whatever they studied?
If they take the right courses. They must take a transfer credit set of courses. They have to take what the university wants. They have to take languages, they have to take mathematics, they have to take all that.
But it's important to mention that it's known a priori, which is not the case here in Israel. The students know exactly which kind of courses to take.
Yeah, but once they take it, they get full credit.
Exactly.
They get full credit. They get full credit.
Could you say a few words? Yes, about the interrelation and balance of powers between the regents and who appoint them, whoever appoints them, and the faculty.
Yes, no, an excellent question. The regents are appointed by the governor, but their terms are long, 12 years. It used to be 16, now it's 12. The reason for that is that a governor, if elected twice, can only serve for 8 years. So the idea is that a single governor of a particular party cannot fill the Board of Regents with his or her appointments, so that there will be a balance, political balance within the regents. Okay? The regents also have private money, and they gather, their gifts are given to them, and they accept on behalf of the university, and they use that money sometimes to help out on the campuses. The one interesting thing I did not mention to you in all of this story was that the president's office started engaging in rather scandalous behavior about 3 or 4 years ago. That is, they lost track of the budget. The reporters wanted to know how the money was being spent in the president's office. The president, who was then a physicist, didn't know how the money was being spent, and the reporters kept coming up with, well, $30,000 was spent on a dog run for one of the chancellors. There are parties being given for people who are retiring. Who's paying for that? Is that public money? The president could not answer. He was asked to leave about a year ago, and a new president was being brought in, a Jewish guy, as a matter of fact, Yudof, a lawyer from the University of Texas. He was brought in to clean up the mess. I had lunch with a member of the Board of Regents just after the sacking of the other president. She happened to be the sister of a friend of mine. A very, very prominent and wealthy Asian American family. Loaded with money. She's a Republican, her sister, my friend, is a Democrat, anyhow, but they're very capable people. And I said, I asked her about the budget. She said, no one in the president's office knew how much money was being spent in the president's office. As we got all those people, those budgetary specialists, analysts, they didn't know. And the regents were never informed about some of these expenditures that now seem to be scandalous. One major reform that was proposed, and I'm not so sure it's been carried out, was to reduce the number of people in the president's office. There were, at one point, maybe 1,100. Yeah. If that we know about. We don't always know about them. And that they said, she told me that it should come down to about 500. But games are played, I'm afraid, in academia, because your figures may show that you've reduced the numbers of staff people, but they may be given jobs on the campuses. It's the lack of transparency that has contributed to the difficulty. It didn't cause it, but it sure has contributed to it. The lesson always is, when it's somebody else's money, make sure you tell them how you're spending it. It's really a major principle, okay?
Could you elaborate, please, about the division of power between the regions and the Senate?
Ah, that was asked, yeah.
That was actually, I believe, the question.
There have been conflicts historically between the two, depending on sometimes the faculty was more to the left, the regents more to the right. That's not the situation at the moment. The regents and the faculty are pretty much in common agreement. And there's a good deal of deferred, or what we call shared governance in the University of California, the president's office sharing major decision-making with the academic senate. And the academic senate is composed of everyone who has a tenured appointment, so it's no small body. There is no representation on the board of regents of any professor. There are in some states. And the reason for that is that the professors and the Senate wants to keep separate, no conflict of interest. The moment you serve on the Board of Regents, you do not represent anymore you're compromised in your ability to defend academic interests. There is a student, always a student, who sits on the Board of Regents. So the students wanted it, they demanded it. That was part of the 1960 arrangement. So there is a student, but they're not troublemakers anymore. So that's not a problem. And one person, anyhow, wouldn't matter. So there is a clear division. You could talk about the university as having a board of regents, a president, chancellors, senate, students, and alumni. And all those components play a role and so on. So it is possible for the faculty to be in conflict, even with the president, and that occurred in 1920. There was no Senate up until then, and a conflict with the president created a Senate. But right now, that's not, everybody's working together.
I want to interject, to use my advantage. Two questions. First, it's not clear to me, I mean, California having established such an exemplary free system, why wasn't it copied by other states within the United States? I'm not talking about, because, you know, they talk here in Israel that we should follow this example. But if the model is so fine, why was it not, at least during the heyday? The second question is, the budgeted problem afflicts all levels, all tiers. So why would it endanger this three-tier structure that the California has?
Okay. Yeah, right. Excellent. So I think the answer to the first, I may have passed over it rather too quickly. I'm not sure about every one of the states and why, but it's always a political decision. And that's why I said the master plan could not be passed today. It was a consequence of particular political attitudes of the 1960s, and the wealth of California in that situation wasn't the same everywhere. Also, when you get to the eastern states, private education is the strongest. Massachusetts cannot really have it wants, but it can't really have a state university as good as those of the University of California, because it has Harvard to contend with, MIT to contend with, and all the famous liberal arts colleges. So the East, it was a West Coast phenomenon, and the historical circumstances. The budgetary situation has, plus something else, but has led to great state discontent, because whereas it was once the master plan stated that anyone who met the qualifications of the University of California would find a position as a entering position within the University of California. That's no longer true. No longer true, because you have lots of people who can't afford to go. You also have terrific competitiveness to get in, and that wasn't true 50 years ago. At the graduate level, yes, but not at the undergraduate level, yes. So there isn't enough money for scholarships and student support. The loan system is broken in America. The Obama administration has taken it over because it was full of corruption from the private banks. Okay? So the whole system has been endangered. Transfer students can't now, places tighten up, can't fund them anymore. Also, the University of California becomes overcrowded. If it takes too many more, the classrooms are now overcrowded. You're going to get it's not like Italy or France yet. Not anywhere near there. But the whole system is in danger. A great deal of public discontent because you can't get your children into the system.
As I'm sure you're aware, we have one or two problems here with our system of public education. And issues that we're dealing with, and I wanted to see how you're dealing with them in California and in other places. One has to do with a dichotomy in Israel between accountability for outcomes on the one hand, and the authority to decide on the allocation of funds or money on the other hand, at different levels in the hierarchy, from the top university rungs to the bottom one at the departmental level. There is a dichotomy here. Another one has to do with what seems to me a confusion here between transparency and micromanagement. On the one hand, the need for, as you say, it's public money, to be completely open on the use of money. It seems to me that we tend to, at least in some of the public debate, confuse between the two, and the need for outsiders or from above or from wherever to decide also on the allocation. Comes back to the same kind of issue, which now brings me to the question. In California, when you have to make decisions on hiring, on salaries, on teaching, on closing departments, closing disciplines, opening disciplines, on the various levels of running a university, from the departmental level to the top, what is the distribution or what are the guidelines or the rule of thumb in the sense of the connection or breaking the dichotomy between accountability for results at each of the levels and the ability to implement or to utilize or to allocate funds at those levels to achieve the goals that you want to achieve?
Okay. Full question. Let's see. First of all, this concern for output and output results and the measurement of
I'm an
output.
economist, by the way.
Yeah, but the output, which is such a British thing, and it's all over Europe, and Israel is concerned about how do you measure output, what kind of indicators you use. Americans have been concerned largely with inputs. Okay.
I'm not talking about outputs, I'm talking about inputs.
Oh, inputs.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we were concerned, well, so we use that word differently. We can use that word differently. But at any rate, let me bypass the question by getting to the larger way of how the budgets are allocated and who does it, okay? Okay? Let's just deal with the 10-campus system of the University of California. Each of the campuses submits a budget to the president's office, okay? Negotiations are going on all the time with chancellors and the president's office. The president's office then submits a block grant request to the state. Lots of discussion there, negotiation. A block of money comes back to the campuses. The state has not determined how it should be allocated, although when Ronald Reagan was governor, before he became president, he really tried to get into that game, okay? But on the whole, the regions have that constitutional independence. Give them the money, but the right to distribute it is the gentle responsibility. But they don't do it. They give it to the president. The president consults with the chancellor. The money gets distributed. The chancellor has by and large determined what he or she wants with consultation with the academic senate. The academic senate of the University of California is the most powerful academic senate in the United States. Chancellor won't do anything without consulting the senate. It would be not good form. It might lead to trouble. Because faculty, faculty, when aroused, faculty members are troublesome. You don't want that. But it's also because the legitimate... there's usually some faculty members on the search committee. Yeah. The regents are responsible for that, and the president, but there's always consultation with the campuses. Really, the Senate structure is extraordinarily strong. And what is really powerful at the University of California is what's called the budget. Each campus has a different name for it, but the Budget and Interdepartmental Affairs Committee of the division, the Berkeley division of the Academic Senate of the University of California. Mouthful. A body of 7 or 8 people who serve for 3 years and are selected not by vote, but by the Committee on Committees of the Academic Senate, which is a committee that's voted in. I once served as chair of that committee. I agreed to run because I thought I'd lose, and then no one would bother me, so I won. So we appointed everyone. We know who's on that committee. It is so secret how they operate, it's really amazing that there are no leaks. They determine they approve every faculty appointment, every salary level, everything, okay? And the chancellor has the right to veto and does so only 5% of the time, and those were largely on affirmative action cases about 20 years ago. The regents can overturn any appointment, and during the McCarthy era period, if you know that one, they tried to. But the regents stay out of this altogether. It is really believed and felt that faculty know best what the quality should be. So quality determination lies with the Senate. The state colleges work somewhat differently. They also have senates, and I'm not sure what their levels of consultation are. The community colleges have largely given up on tenure. Well, that means the presidents of the community colleges make all the decisions. They're hiring by contract, 1-year contract to teach Chinese. But they have lost the loyalty of the faculty. If you're not tenured in an institution, you have no loyalty to it. I don't know if that helps, but it is pretty much an independent process once the budget is received. Budget has to be negotiated.
Within the university, I understand from the top down, within the university, there's new freedom in terms of budgets at the level of deans and the level of department chairs.
Pretty good. Pretty good.
You know your budget, basically,
yes.
And then you're free to use it along the guidelines that the
yes.
university has, but without having to go up the system to get approval for every little thing that you do.
Right.
Or you decided from above and everything.
No, bottom up. The departments have submitted a budget. You want so many, based on history. You had so much money last year to spend on staff and on this and that. And that goes to the deans and it goes all the way up. And it's discussed continually. Then a figure is arrived at. Sometimes the departments don't get what they asked for, but it's internal decision. It's not, the legislature has nothing to do with that internal allocation, and the president leaves it alone as well. The chancellor could intervene, but he leaves it alone. Once in a while.
Sheldon, you mentioned initially there was about 66% public funding to the university system, as is the case here, which ranges from 50 to 70%, depending on the university, except Weizmann, which has a lot less. Now it's 25.
Or something, or maybe falling.
Maybe falling. When a university becomes, what keeps it public? Let's say it goes down to 10%. Is it worthwhile to keep it public, or should it become a private university at that time because you get all your income from other sources? When is a public university public, and what level of funding that requires?
That is a really, it's a great question. Let's take the one example of a place that is practically privatized, and that's the University of Michigan. A single campus, University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, one of the leading research universities in the United States. I saw the other day that its budget from the state of Michigan is 7%. Operating expenses. Well, the state of Michigan has lost the automobile industry. That was its principal, but this has been going on for 50 years. They were down to 11. Now I saw 7. But they're a single campus, and they have found a way to do this. First of all, high tuition costs. They draw used to draw at least a lot of students from New York. And originally they were Jewish students who couldn't get into the Ivy League because of the prejudices against them. They went to the University of Michigan. Find a lot from a certain generation Jewish students. You'll find they have University of Michigan degrees, whereas now they would have Yale or Harvard degrees. So they have found a way to do it. There was discussion, maybe. You see, the master plan creates a system. Could Berkeley ever go it alone? No, not under those terms. But we have got an historical experiment going on along the lines that you've said. All right, so the budget keeps dropping as a percentage of operating expenses, lower and lower and lower. As a consequence, tuition fees go higher and higher and higher. And whereas they may not reach those of a private institution, they're getting pretty high. More and more money then is sought from private donors. And because California has the University of California has such a large number of alumni that are rich and are all worldwide, I'm told that a lot of money comes in from Taiwan, graduates, but also people associated with the university. You begin to more and more private money. More and more professorial positions are not being funded by the state, but by private money, like the private ones.
And research funds.
And research funds. Research funds always came from Washington by and large, but you do have agreements with British Petroleum on the electric car, and Novartis, the chemical firm in Switzerland, which gave money. You have that sort of thing. You're doing what all institutions elsewhere are doing. You're pursuing alternative sources of funding. At what point this is your question, at what point do we cease to talk about a public university? So the joke in California was, we were once a public institution. We then became a publicly assisted institution, and we are now a publicly associated institution. That's the joke. So I don't know.
And where does it all lead?
Well, as we say in Yiddish, Fregner Vinzer Kakashis, I really don't know.
But the political structure remains the same. I mean, you still have the trustees appointed by the governor, although the state supports a very minute part of the operation of the government.
You still have that. You still have that system. Yeah. In the University of California, State College different.
What about Michigan?
But you know,
they have a board of trustees.
Sheldon, I think that holds on because you have internal freedom, setting salaries and many other things. You have so much freedom, almost like a private university. Unless that, you probably would have broken and become private, like Berkeley, the leading worldwide institution. Okay? And in Israel, we don't have that freedom within the university.
No.
Government support drops, and universities are not independent to run their affairs as they want to do it. Yeah. And that's a major problem which ought to be changed.
That's a major problem. And let me go back to those 10 years and the first years of the university, right? It was because of the crisis that the university was almost destroyed, that the Constitution was revised to create an independent university. I should tell you one other thing. There is now a movement to found another constitutional convention in the state of California to redo the state constitution. That's the only way to go. to get past the impasse of the plebiscitarian constitution. Ladies and gentlemen, I fear it will fail.
One question related to the master plan. What was the proportion of the relevant student cohort that participated in each of the 3 tiers, and has this proportion shifted throughout the year, because many more students are right now, but still the proportion is the same? And the second question goes a little bit beyond the master plan of California, but I think Professor Trachtenberg is very much speaking now also on the master degree, and you are very much aware, since we had our program in Van Leer about the problematics of the master and the graduate degrees here in Israel. Would you like to say some words on, because here according to the statistics, the average time that takes for a master degree with a thesis is more than 4 years, which is quite abnormal, related both not only to California, but to the United States and Europe. Would you like to say some things about the graduate degrees, and mainly the master in the United States?
Sarah, yeah, she wants, I'm not, Sarah, yeah, there are 2 questions that we want to be clear about. Well, may I ask you, Alex, just a second, I'll try to get back to this. Sarah, the reason for the long master's degree, is it a consequence of part-time instruction or a consequence of the degree requirements? Okay.
Both, but very much the degree requirements, particularly the thesis.
Okay, that can be addressed, and you know, Bologna is addressing, the Europeans are addressing that. That will probably have to be addressed, because you don't want students hanging around for 4 years for a master's thesis. We used to have that problem at Berkeley, and we abolished the thesis for the master's degree. It's still in the books, but basically it's by examination. The other question is an easy one. The master plan states that 12.5% of the high school graduates in the state will be eligible for entry to the university. Doesn't mean that they're going to get in. The key word is eligible. There was I once had a lawyer who fought with me on this, arguing that because he was going back to get a higher degree, because he had been told that he was eligible, he was automatically admitted. And he didn't, even though he's a lawyer, he didn't understand the difference between being eligible in a pool and being admitted. 12.5%. That was not getting the Hispanic and African American students. All right, they weren't in the 12.5% of their high school classes. So then it began to be interpreted 12.5% of the total pool of graduates, to hope that you could pull in some more. And there are more games being played along that way all the time because of the affirmative action issue. I haven't talked about that, but you all know about that. 33% will be the eligibility pool for the state colleges and universities, and the community colleges open admission. As long as there are places, you can go. And they used to be virtually free, and they're still fairly free.
I'm interested to get a better idea about the tuition system. Is it unified within the UC system? You spoke about differential tuition for law and medicine. How does it work? Who makes a decision about the 3-tier system? So if you could please elaborate on that.
Who makes the decisions about the
tuition in the community college, in the state university, in the UC, and within the UC, is in Berkeley and UCI the same tuition?
A good question. The individual campuses have some flexibility in setting their fees. They're fairly close, but they have some flexibility in that. They also have some flexibility in their admissions. They all have to adhere to a minimum admission standard, true of all the campuses, but then, you know, some campuses get more higher achieving students and so on. Not sure about the community college system. I suspect that each district, I think because they come under districts, that the district sets the fees. There may be more than one community college in a given district. And I think the individual state college campuses also have a certain flexibility in setting their fees. So by and large, it is the state does not intervene in that at all, but when the public is aroused because the tuition costs are rising, then the legislatures get letters from parents, and it becomes a public issue. Remember, the political problem or the political issue always to be discussed with a democratic society is the legitimacy of your institution. And legitimacy changes historically. Clark Kerr felt that the legitimacy of the elite part of the University of California system depended on the other kinds of institutions surrounding and supporting them. That's why the transfer function he thought was so important. He was willing to give up what the great private universities and colleges have in the United States, completely select admissions. So that you simply got the very best, and you went by the very best according to standardized scores or marks or whatever. He was willing to give that up because he felt the legitimacy of the institution, public institution, depended upon that. The presidents that we have had since Clark Kerr, with one exception, have forgotten the political principle of legitimacy. That has to be renegotiated in every generation. The voting public changes in its composition. The legislature changes its composition. Try to play by the old rules? They don't work. There has to be a continual give and take between the various decision-forming elements of a democratic society. We got leaders who forgot that. They added to the problems, even if they didn't create them.
But Sheldon, I think you did state that within the same campus there could be differential tuition depending on the profession. Like medical students, say, more.
Yes, within a given university, the schools can set their fees. Berkeley does not have a medical school. The medical school is the University of California, San Francisco is the medical school. It's a separate institution. UCLA has a medical school. University of California, Davis has a medical school. They set their fees. They set their admission standard. They set their criteria. Yeah, they do.
Hearing your description about the money and the president who didn't know where the money has gone, I mean, where has all the money gone? So I felt that in Israel we still have a way to go. I mean, we have problem of that some presidents knew where the money gone, but the question that he didn't know what's going on, it's amazing. I'm wondering about, in conclusion, to what extent you believe the academic appointments are totally clean. I mean, no political influence about it. Affirmative action, I'm wondering to what percentage there are affirmative action appointments. But I'm wondering, first of all, about appointments. Secondly, about, suppose you want to open a faculty or to keep a faculty or a department dealing with Japanese history. Can you take this decision by professional people who think about academic freedom? Or would you have to deal with people who look at it from economical point of view? Right. And which might be a problem in history, faculty of history, it may be a special problems. And this is the question, to what extent you believe the political influence is interfering in the process of academic of university?
Okay, very good question. My broad answer is that, to use a football metaphor, professors are very good at breaking open field tackles. You really have to tackle them closely or they get away. There are political appointments, but they have to be understood in a particular way. Historically, if you go through the history of academic freedom as a big subject, universities always regarded the threat to academic freedom to come from the outside, to come from churches, to come from states, to come from fanatics outside. In my lifetime, the real threat to academic freedom has come from within the institution itself. And that has been a consequence of, in America and elsewhere, of major ideological shifts. The women's movement. There was pressure to hire women. Now, in certain pools of, in certain areas, women candidates were numerous. There was no problem. But in certain fields, like engineering, they were not at a certain time. There was then talk and pressure about that kind of appointment. With the ethnic minorities in the United States, all the time there was that talk that there had to be maybe special considerations given in those appointments. A lot of internal fighting, a lot of terrific fighting.
And occasionally, way back, the chancellor overruled the budget committee on the Berkeley campus, which denied tenure to an African American because he was inadequate, and he was inadequate. But he happened to have been an Olympic champion, the one who stood in Mexico City with a clenched fist for black power, and he was well connected to the sports community in the San Francisco Bay Area, and he made a big fuss, okay? And eventually the chancellor simply overruled the faculty. That goes on, but I still think in the vast majority of cases, the decisions are made according to careful peer review. I believe that is the case in my own experience. But academics are people. They bear with them various kinds of political views and attitudes. These eventually are insinuated into the institutions, and a lot of fights go on. I think mistakes have been made in this category. I think the better chance now, because after 40 years and so on, we are getting better pools of candidates from the minority groups. But you know that one of Berkeley's first hirings of an African American was of a social worker for the community who carried a gun. The faculty did not want that appointment. So listen to how it was handled. A special division was created outside the regular departments for ethnic studies. And people who would not pass the criteria for appointment in a regular academic department were put there. Everyone knew that it was a low-status department. And of course, after a new generation of ethnic studies people came in, they agitated for higher approval because they could now submit the legitimate qualifications. But the beginning was nasty, okay? I'll give you a personal anecdote. I was once the dean of students in charge of all students at College of Letters and Science. There was about 17,000 students. We, the deans in that college, were responsible for dismissing students with inadequate academic records. I dismissed the leading football player on the football team. You know what athletics are and sports in America, okay? He was a miserable student. He was a fairly good runner, and when he entered professional life, he became a drug addict. That was his history, okay? I dismissed him, and the provost wanted to discuss this because he'd been getting phone calls. And what should he do? I said, I don't know what you should do. I did what I did. And he said, but, you know, he said, the chancellor has been getting so much pressure from the outside that he may remove me from my job. So I said, well, that's your problem. It's not my problem. I don't have to worry about it. What do you worry about? You go back to the Department of Biology. He's a biologist. But no, he liked being provost. He didn't want to go back to the Department of Biology. So I said, you can overrule me if you like, but I'm not changing my mind. And it will be clear that the deans made a particular decision and you changed it. It will be known to everybody you changed it, and they'll know why. And I may not keep my mouth shut either. You know. So he found a way of taking this guy who was in the College of Letters and Science, the general one, and sticking him in the Division of Ethnic Studies, which is outside the college, and to put him there as a holding operation until they could get rid of him, that is, until he used up his eligibility. That sort of thing went on all over the United States. Look, there are a lot of problems, too, about the Muslims in America and anti-Jewish sentiment in American universities. There was a recent academic freedom case of a man who was simply, I don't know, he worked on Native American studies. He wasn't a Native American, but he fabricated his evidence. He clearly met no legitimate standard of scholarship, and he claimed, and he had tenure, and he was dismissed by the chancellor upon the recommendation of the professors. All the professors hemmed and hawed, and they had trouble finding the exact criteria. They're worried about the violation of academic freedom, even though this man is clearly a fraud. Well, he made what you do in America is you engage a lawyer and you start law proceedings. That and for all I know, he might even be reinstated on the grounds that the university dismissed him on a technicality. and violated his academic freedom. It's going on all over the United States all the time. It does not define the systems, but it's there. And I think it's there in other countries as well.
Sheldon, thank you very much for sharing your experience.